So welcome to the breakout session for the Construction Progress Coalition. This is the inclusion and diversity session. I think this is our 5th or 6th roundtable. And let me just quickly share my screen so we can kind of get a sense of what we're going to talk about today. So today we're here to talk about inclusion and diversity specifically, but the topic of intersectionality and really looking at what does that mean? How does that influence or affect us as an industry, either in tech supporting construction or as a construction industry in general? And really kind of look at how this impacts all of our lives. Today, we're going to be doing things just slightly different. We're going to actually have more of a fireside chat where we've brought in a single subject matter expert who will be speaking to us of his experience in the industry, kind of giving us personal insight into his story and what that experience is like. So Ezra Teshome,
you got it.
Ezra will be sharing his experience with us. And as we engage in the conversation around, the topics of inclusion and diversity, we believe that there are 3 components that are really important for facilitating sustainable change. And those are leading with curiosity, listening with the intent to build empathy, and finally taking action. So as we dive into this conversation today, we're really going to be focused in the wheelhouse of listening to build empathy, giving Ezra a chance to share his story. But before we dive into that listening stage, I really wanted to give the group a chance to introduce yourselves because we do have a fairly large group here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see everybody. And I'm going to go ahead and call on you so you don't have to worry about awkwardly jumping in or not. Introverts, extroverts, you have no control. I'll be picking on you and calling on you. And I want to go around the room, and if each of you could introduce yourselves to us. So give us your name, the company that you work for, your position with that company, and then I'm going to ask you to answer a question. And because we're all in the inclusion and diversity roundtable, there's an assumption that there's an interest on your part. And the question I'm going to ask is, where do you feel inclusion and diversity is working or where it's missing the mark? So depending on your experience with this, our current efforts around inclusion and diversity may be working and improving things, or maybe missing the mark altogether. And so I wanted to start off with that perspective. So Rebecca, I'm actually going to start with you and have you introduce yourself.
And the question is how I feel like inclusion is missing the mark?
Either it's working or it's missing the mark, whichever perspective you come from.
Okay. Maybe I steered toward my direction already because that's the part I heard. My name is Rebecca Sharp. I'm an operations technology manager with Balfour Beatty. And I will give a quick caveat that I've been with Balfour Beatty for 2 weeks. And so a lot of what I'm saying may be not directly related to Balfour Beatty. So I just want to give that caveat. But I think in general, as a woman in construction, it has been hard to feel like I don't have to constantly prove myself more than my coworkers have to prove themselves for equal treatment. So to me, that's one of the ways that the industry as a whole might be missing a mark from just my own personal experience when I was in project management on the job site in the past.
Mm-hmm. Good, and I appreciate the honesty and transparency. I think that's a big part of this conversation, is being able to share your perspective, because there's a guarantee somebody's going to agree, somebody may not see what you see, but there's definitely a discussion to come from it. So thank you. Carlos, I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
So hi, my name is Carlos Zuluaga. I work with Harkins Builders as a project engineer. I'm actually in the field every day, getting things done, grinding. And regarding the questions, I think what's working is that is being discussed a lot. In fact, I see these, these groups coming out. I see a lot of email newsletters discussing inclusion and diversity in the AEC industry, and it's fantastic that this thing's starting to become very important for a lot of people. But I still see that we are not diverse enough. In general, when I guess in the GCs, it's still like a very white male dominated area. I love to see more women. I love to see more people of color, perhaps more even international people as myself just joining the industry. So I think we still have to do a little bit better there.
Good, thank you, I appreciate that. Jim, I'll go to you next.
I'm Jim Andrews, and I'm either probably the oldest one in the group, either that or I'm aging more prematurely than the rest of you, but, which could be possible too. So. But I've been in construction and development for over 30 years, and I own a construction company that's a structural steel erector based in the Pacific Northwest. I've owned this company for over 16 years now. And I also have a tech startup, which is a software company that was started out of my company, construction company, with software solution for subcontractors. So I find myself in this unique position where I'm in multiple arenas, but kind of ground zero for me is the construction world, which is interesting because there's so many different levels of diversity needed. And it really is everything from ethnicity to color to women to even education, the difference in education between the software world and the construction world. I'm up until a recent hire of a chief operating officer over in the construction side, I was the only one with a college degree within the company, for years and years. So you got that dynamic that's taking place too. Where do I feel it's working and missing the mark? I've been really engaged in this arena for the last 5 to 8 years in doing things outside of the construction world in terms of working and just immersing myself. I have 3 kids I adopted from China, so that kind of began to change my world 10 years ago in terms of ethnicity and an awareness that I didn't know I needed. So I would say we're missing the mark a lot more than we're doing it, other than the fact that we're having these kind of conversations. This is where things are starting to happen and things are happening but we are so far away from where we should be. And like Carlos was saying, it's pretty much a dominant white male industry. And I even kind of see that in a little bit, even the tech side as well. So. Yeah,
lots of similarities there, definitely. Thank you so much. Kelsey, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Kelsey Poinsatte-Jones. I am on the tech side of construction. My background's actually environmental science and policy, but I became attracted to product design around the user and ended up in construction. My dad's in construction. So I am with a company called Kwant.ai. We improve productivity and safety on construction sites, and we're moving global. We're based here in New York, and I'm the head of growth. So doing sales, but not just doing sales, also marketing and working on the product. And I'm part of, I've been in the construction tech now for about a year, and it's definitely male dominated. As the other participants have been saying, we had a customer roundtable yesterday, and we love our customers. This is no problem with our customers, but definitely the white male dominated, I noticed, was the dominant voice. Always good to include, the voice of your customer, but would love to see more diversity in the field in general. I am part of Professional Women in Construction, so I think we are really strong there. I love that group. And Sasha, I've seen you there, so I do want to hit a few high notes. Sasha, I've already identified you as kind of the leader of inclusion in the industry, and Procore in particular. I mean, the CEO of Procore, I've seen him come out on Twitter, with regards to Black rights. And I I think that's important, actually. You need to have some leaders identified in the field and some voices that you can always go to and say, hey, these are voices we can rely on. These are strong people that really care about this issue and believe about this issue in this industry, and they're going to kind of carry that flag. So that's a high mark there, and we would just love to see more of that in each organization, not just Procore, but I would love to be able to list 5 companies right now that are carrying that flag.
You and me both. So let's peer pressure them into getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. Thanks so much, Kelsey. Appreciate that. Eric, I'll have you introduce yourself next.
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
Sounds good.
Great. I'm Eric Hobry. I'm the Director of Technology for ARCO National Construction. We're a general contractor based in Chicago, Illinois, where I am in my office at home. I have a background in technology. I did not have a background in construction. I had a career in advertising and marketing technology before joining ARCO, and the last couple of years have been working on building a tech strategy for the business at large, not just internally, but how we interact with our clients and how we do our work and how we share that with the world. When it comes to diversity and inclusion and where I think it's working and where it's missing the mark, I think it's hard to choose from the long list of where we're missing the mark. So I will try to be optimistic and focus on what I've experienced at ARCO, and that is just an effort to educate. We definitely are predominantly white, predominantly male company. We have made an effort to include more women in leadership. Before I was ever at ARCO, I think that was something that was already well in motion. And I think where one glaring area where we and the industry are missing the mark is putting people of color and women in positions of power in their businesses, not just hiring them in those junior roles or entry-level roles where people may not feel comfortable in a culture full of predominantly white male engineers, but really working with people from different backgrounds to try to reshape and redefine a culture. And I think we are putting in the work for that. We have an immensely long way to go, but we're definitely having the conversations internally in a way that is encouraging. So that's a small step, but a step in the right direction. And just the fact that I can join this group and hear Ezra's story and share anything with this group and feel that we're supporting each other and looking to push the industry in the right direction is also a step in the right direction, I think. So happy to be here. So thanks for including me, and looking forward to listening and learning.
Thanks, Eric. We're really glad you're here, and thank you for sharing your perspective. Jeff Sample.
I gotta hit the unmute button. Sitting on the couch. Didn't know there was quizzes today. No. So I'm Jeff Sample. I'm the Director of Strategic Accounts at eSUB, and I have had the pleasure of working with Sasha for, believe it or not, I think we're going on 8 or 9 years now. And I think you have to go back and say what we're doing well is that we're actually having these conversations now. We're having them more and more, and we're reacting more and more to take advantage of the unfortunate situations that are going on in our world and to try to make a difference and make a change. I had the pleasure of being called the white boy you didn't see coming that kicked the door open on stage before, because I do look that part and I am that part. However, that's not what my background is or where I come from. So I feel very different about diversity. Where I think we're actually failing, and I think this is an advanced failure, so down the road, is that we are looking for people that match a diversity of whatever you're looking for, ethnicity, female, etc. But we're looking for people that fit our culture, and it's actually not the way to go. We want the things in our culture that are missing. If you fit culture, then you end up monochromatic, and it doesn't really matter if our skin looks the same or our genders are different, our skin are different. We end up thinking the same way, and that's why we can't grow anymore. So for me, that's really the next evolution. We get to have the conversations, and then we get to evolve them. And as Sasha knows, I could sit here and talk for hours about it. And I'm super excited that we have Ezra here to talk about it. And Sasha, that you are stepping out into this world. We need this type of leadership. So that's where I'm at. That's where I think we're going. And I'm excited to sit around and talk.
I will never forget that. The white boy didn't see coming. I was not ready for that one. But I love it. And thank you, Jeff, for your co-leadership. This is something Jeff and I have talked about, eSUB and Procore, two companies that if you look at us on a market graph, we may be head-to-head competitors, but in this space, we're not competing. This is something that matters to all of us and is a crucial part of us really solving the complex problems that face the industry, is having a diverse set of eyes to solve those problems together. Dan, I do want to give you a chance to introduce yourself before I jump into Ezra. So I'm so glad you've still been able to hang on and you haven't had to pop off or jump to another meeting. So introduce yourself if you don't mind.
People constantly come over this way, so disregard if I'm talking over that way. Anyways, Dan Smolilo, Director of Process Innovation at the Walsh Group. Reiterating Jeff's point, I think that is a known issue, not just in the industry, not necessarily at Walsh. Everybody has their kind of monochromatics within their organizations. There was an interesting anthology of Ulta Beauty. They have the reverse issue of they can't hire males because it's all females working in the industry. So how do you get males to come into work for a beauty company? It's not as this or that. But I think one thing that me personally that I think we struggle with as not necessarily an industry but a society is the narrative. You're a female in the industry, therefore you cannot excel. You're of different color in the industry, so you can't excel. And whether you can or can't, hearing that narrative over and over and over and over again immediately builds that roadblock in your mind. Condoleezza Rice was at my girlfriend's work and made a very interesting comment. She never once put being female as a limitation to what she wanted or where she was trying to head. So I think as a society, we're instilling our own roadblocks at times by insinuating I am this, therefore I can't do this, or they are that, therefore they can't do that. So we set up these inherent paradigms that we have to face, and we created them ourselves, not necessarily an industry or a company or things like that. That being said, there are industries that do kind of, whether they're unethical or this or that. But I think mentally, it's like COVID. You wake up, you cough one morning and you're like, oh my God, I have COVID. And then you go down this spiral of think you have the symptoms, therefore you become sick. And it's your own mentality that causes you to get sick. So that same thing goes into, well, I can't accomplish this because the world is against me and it's impossible. I always try to strive with anyone that I work with that the mentality is so much more important. Don't worry about their opinion. Don't worry about this. Don't worry about that. And that's very difficult to do. Empower yourself to promote yourself. Look forward to what you can do, what you can accomplish, and move forward with that. There are always going to be extenuating circumstances. There's always going to be other people that are going to try and bring you down or get in your way. But if you empower yourself and you focus on the positivity, you'll be able to move mountains.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it. I wasn't quite ready for that inspirational speech coming from Dan. I know Dan to be a very critical thinker, so that was actually kind of interesting and nice to hear. But I think you bring up a very good point, which will lead us very well into this conversation with Ezra today, which is really talking about intersectionality. So there are the ideas of we as individuals have our own ability to define our future and to create our future and to leverage our own empowerment to step into opportunities and create opportunities. But there is another side, which many of those who are not of the majority who work in construction experience something really, really different, which is regardless of your own empowerment, there are impediments in our path, and there are things in our path that keep us from truly being able to achieve the same level of success. And that's what we really want to speak to today. And so Ezra, I would love to thank you so much, first of all, for being part of our Listening to Build Empathy today. Really excited to give you a chance to share your story. But to kind of start off, I know at the Construction Progress Coalition, one of our biggest first steps we ever do when having a conversation is to speak to definitions, to define what it is we're talking about, so we can all triangulate and do the mall map. You are here, if you think about it, or if you think about a model, X, Y, and Z, let's figure out where X and Y meet. And I wanted to get your definition of intersectionality and how you interpret that word.
Yeah, totally. Sasha, Nathan and I kind of talked about this in our own separate meeting. And I think all of us have heard the concept behind diversity and inclusion, and it's such a beautiful idea to bring people from different, diverse backgrounds together, to be able to work together in a place that would be inclusive for everybody. I'm kind of a skeptic in some parts of my life, I guess you could say. And so whenever I hear those two words, I always think of, corporation mindset. I used to work for a large conglomerate, a large company that was a developer and a general contractor. And diversity and inclusion was like one of the greatest values that the company had. But I personally felt like there was a lot lacking and I didn't see it. So when I look at the definition behind inclusion, I start to think of the ideas of assimilation. And I start to think about how this country has created this concept of assimilation where everyone needs to kind of fit this certain mold. They kind of have to look a certain way and fit this certain culture, as Jeff said earlier. And so when I think about the idea of inclusion, it's who's including who, right? So like, who's including who? So is this white people including Black people? Is this white people including indigenous people? Is this white people including Latinx people? Who's including who, right? So if you notice, I just said white people including all these other people, and that's how it's felt like to me, because I'm going into this workspace where everybody that is a decision maker for that company is a white man. So I personally dislike that word, and I steer clear as far as I can, whenever I can. I mean, we're all kind of conditioned to use it, so I use it. But I really like the idea of intersectionality, because to me, that shows that there's a complexity of a person. Like, I'm a Black person. I'm also Ethiopian. I'm also Ethiopian American. I'm also queer. So I have so many different layers to who I am as a person. And I think that I'm not here to parse out, who I am and section myself out just so people can understand me. I'm just who I am. And whether people choose to understand me or not, it's kind of their decision. All I'm going to do is love myself and love folks, love people. So that's all I got. Does that kind of answer that question for you?
Yeah, it does. And I think it is a word that is a bit of a hot button in our country today. Because of that, you're speaking of how things, I think of many times of a Venn diagram, except we're not talking about the places where they really blend. We're talking about the places where we can't really find the blend. We can't really find that overlap, or that overlap that in a majority's mind may believe exists is not the same experience for somebody else who's coming from a minority group experiencing the overlap or the blend. I would really love for you, Ezra, to tell us your story about how you came into industry, what your experience was like, and what brought you to where you are today.
Yeah. This is something that I've been working on for the company that I work with right now. We're called Join. We're a pre-construction project management software. It's trying to create more collaboration between designers, owners, and general contractors. And so my background comes from previously working for different general contractors and a developer. But let me start from how I ended up there. So I went to college in North Carolina. I studied construction management. And so I went from that space into the construction world. And so I started writing a blog post recently, just kind of like trying to organize all these events that happen in my life as kind of like a timeline to kind of explain what's going on. And I already feel like I'm deviating from how I was going to talk about this, so I'm sorry. This might seem a little disjointed, but my blog post really will go through like in a very thorough, detailed way of how I kind of end up in the industry and how I see the future of the industry growing and moving in a positive direction. So, all right, let me start back with my college experience. So, studied construction management. While I was in school, I was learning and seeing how systemically how my education was geared to basically benefit and perpetuate what we see in the industry right now, which is a lot of white men, in executive leadership roles. I started seeing that all my professors were mostly white men. People in my classes were people whose parents, grandparents, uncles have owned general contracting firms, have owned construction firms. And so these folks are going to school, being taught, like they already have a lot of the knowledge going into the programs already. So they already have a leg up as soon as they arrive. So then having that and then leaving the school, being able to fall into this catch net that their parents have, safely made for them to be able to thrive in that industry, whether they choose to go work for their uncles, their dads, whoever, and then decide to go wherever they want to go. So I learned that. I saw how that was working. And it was very discouraging as someone whose parents are, immigrants to this country, someone who didn't feel like they had a lot of connections in the industry. So after finishing college, I moved to San Francisco. One of my aunts has like a connection in the construction world, and we weren't very close at the time, but we talked over the phone. We talked about construction stuff, and she was willing to help and kind of get started in the construction world. So as soon as I got to San Francisco, I had a friend out here who was housing me, and I quickly got a job working as a laborer for a landscaping company. And so I had a college degree, and I was shoveling dirt in someone's backyard just so I could afford to live on my friend's sofa. But that was, after that challenging time, I was able to get a job in the industry. My first job after I had my college degree, was to be working as an intern for a small general contractor in San Francisco. And in that space is where I was first introduced to construction technology. So I was working for a company that was using PlanGrid as a form of like, not quite punch listing, but like a quality control tool. And so I was getting to learn how this company would look at deficiencies and look at a checklist before they close up a wall, making sure all the mechanical, electrical, plumbing work is in, making sure all the fire taping and fire code related things were checked off, making sure insulation was in, and making sure nothing was wet, just things of that nature, which we didn't really learn in school. We kind of just knew general terms, but seeing everything come together really happened for me when I was physically exercising, checking off all these things in this app. And so after working with this company as an intern for a couple of months, I started realizing that they had no intention of putting me into a full-time role. So I started looking for other jobs. And so I was able to get a job pretty quickly. And my experience with PlanGrid was actually a big factor that helped me get that next job. The next project I worked on was with a totally different company. And we used that same app. And that gave me a leg up on getting situated there, it really helped me like excel in that space. And then that company also had a woman and an Asian guy who I worked with, and so there was a little bit more diversity in that space as well. And it was a really cool, really great experience for me. And while I was there, I made some really good friends. A few of my counterparts were white men. And, after getting to hang out with people, getting to know people for a couple of years, working with them for a few years, things become a lot more transparent. And you start talking about things about race, about life, about whatever. And in our conversations, I found out that they were getting paid a significant amount more than I was. Even though we graduated the same year, we had the same experience, we were on the same project. Like, that's just what it was. So I obviously brought this up to my manager. It got trickled up to the executive. And so the executive and I were meeting once every few months just to check in and see what was going on. And, I wasn't going to obviously rat out these guys, but I showed them like, hey, look, I went on Glassdoor and found out that someone with my experience should be getting paid this much amount of money. I'm making this much, like, what's the deal here? So I had to argue like for the value of my own, like for the value of myself, which is something that I feel like a lot of people don't have to do. I feel like a lot of women have to do this. A lot of people of color have to do this. And so we had this conversation. It was very civil. The guy was very understanding. And he said, hey, like, we're gonna make sure you get promoted. We know you're doing a great job on this project. Like, the owners, our clients love you. They really appreciate all your hard work and all this stuff. And I'm like, great. So they'll give me a timeline. They'll say, okay, like, give us 6 months or give us 3 months or whatever. That time would come, nothing happens, right? And I think a lot of us have been in this situation before where we're like, okay, so why am I still here? Around that same time, a friend of mine was working for a larger company and they were looking for more people who had my experience. I wanted to work with my friend, and so he kind of recruited me. So I was like, why should I, spend more time with this company if I can just go somewhere else that's better? So I went on and moved to this other company, which was much larger. This company was also a developer. They were a global company. So being able to be heard if you had any indifference was a very difficult thing already. But I decided to go for it just to be able to work with my friend and make a little bit more money. So while I was there at this new company, I saw that, they had the most ancient project management software. Their systems were very rusty and things took a lot of time, and it took a lot of people to do a very simple task. And I realized I couldn't make a difference or make decisions like I was able to in the previous companies that I worked at. And the people that I worked under, I don't know if they were intimidated by me or if they just were not a fan of me. I was also in my mid to early 20s, so I may have been a little obnoxious, but being young and being Black, I feel like did not help trying to convince the 65-year-old white man that we need to change how he's been doing his thing for the last, 20, 30 years. So what I started doing is I started hosting lunch and learns where I would invite a random tech company, a construction technology company, to come in and do a presentation. And I would, negotiate free lunch for a whole flock of people, and people just sat in and watched something and then, got a little bit of fire under their asses to kind of get them thinking. So I remember the first, it was my second month working with this company. So very early on, I invited people from Fieldwire. One of my friends works at Fieldwire, so I invited Marielle. We actually used to work together at a GC prior to Marielle being with Fieldwire. And I invited her to come through and do a presentation for us, and that was really cool. A lot of people were inspired. I was on the superintendent track at the time, so hearing about a tool that was made and targeting folks who were in the field was really cool and refreshing to see. And then a couple of months later, I did a similar thing with Procore, and out of that eventually came a pilot program that me and my team were able to pilot for the company, which was a pretty big deal. at that time, I was an assistant superintendent, so I was still pretty early in my career in the construction world. And so I was able to make what I felt was like an impactful difference. But kind of the reoccurring theme that I started noticing was that people didn't really take me seriously until I was able to show that I was able to navigate with technology. And so leveraging this construction technology, trying to make not just my life easier, but everyone's lives easier that I'm working with, trying to create more transparency was a big factor into me being able to make things happen. And that was super encouraging. And so, am I okay with time here, Sasha? Sorry.
I just have questions, but wrap up your thought, and then I want to ask you a couple questions because I'm seeing some parallels. Okay,
for sure. Yeah, so that was kind of like my time in construction. So I spent just about 5 years in working for GCs and a developer, and I went from working right in the dead middle of construction where all the concrete work is done and they're just starting to put in walls, all the way through punch list, and I even went back to the pre-con section of construction. So I got to see basically the whole life cycle of a building, which was a really cool experience for me. And the last thing that I did in the industry was I spent 1.5 years doing pre-construction work. And that was the most frustrating for me because I realized there was even less technology for that specific part of construction. It's so niche. It's so, the time varies too. Like some companies have 1 year to work on pre-construction stuff. Some companies have a few months. And so it's really hard. You got to put together, like a $200 million contract and have all these documents ready in a very short amount of time. And I personally don't think it's fair, but I think more and more technology is coming into the space to hopefully make stuff better. And now I'm kind of like fast forwarding to a few years later, I've been working with Join for 1 year now. And I've seen just even how our app has evolved with a lot of the customer feedback that we're getting. And it's been really cool to see that.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
I think so for so many people, Eric, maybe your experience is a little bit different, but for so many people like Jim and Kelsey and others, it's if you take the leap into technology, it's because you felt the pain acutely in doing the work that kind of caused you to say, there's got to be an easier way, there's got to be a better way. And one of the things that I wanted to kind of pull out from what your story you just shared was really around this interesting parallel with technology. I'm thinking, listening to your story, if it weren't for Glassdoor, if it weren't for technology that has transparency around salaries and benchmarking salaries, it's very difficult to advocate for yourself. And I can say this as a woman, to advocate for yourself in negotiating your salary. And there have been times, I don't care how much confidence I have, how articulate I am not going to change that other person's mind about giving me equal pay or giving me what I feel I'm worth unless I have something of concrete leverage to use in that conversation. And Glassdoor, having technology like Glassdoor creates accountability and transparency in ways it hasn't before. How are you seeing technology exposing what I will call the opacity in business? Whether it's ill-intended or not, it exists. How are you seeing technology like Glassdoor and other things that are creating transparency? How are you seeing that creating the space for the conversation to have a conversation, a more leveraged conversation around equality?
Is this a question for me?
Yes. And because it was obviously, if you were in the industry 10 years prior, you would not have had that tool. And the conversation
right.
you're having, you would have just felt, what am I not doing in order to get promoted? Rather
right.
than recognizing there is opacity here around this topic that exists. And maybe we shouldn't be talking about me specifically as my performance, but we should be speaking to the organization and the organization's ability to promote from within equally.
Right. I'm going to say this is a very similar parallel to the idea of how people think that racism is a Black people issue, when in fact it's a white people issue, right? I think like if we have been led to believe that we live in this capitalistic world where if your time at work isn't 100% efficient and maximized, then you have room for improvement. You could be doing better. You could be doing this better. And this is why you're not making this much, you know, this much more. And I think that's wrong. I think that this technology has created a lot more transparency to help us see that if we're gonna be making decisions on how much people can get paid, we have to do, even people who are making this decision have to do the research. It shouldn't just be the people who are trying to advocate for a higher salary to be doing this research. I don't know if that's answering the question, but.
Yeah, and I think there's also the topic, and I want to pull this one point out, and then I'm going to open the floor for others to ask you questions. But there's this other topic of the flip side of that being when you spoke to how you felt you were not taken seriously until you really started to leverage technology in ways that was driving the business forward. And that gave a different conversation, a different path to growth and promotion or acceleration or visibility. How has the access to technology and your own ability to master or create mastery around technology changed that trajectory for progress?
Well, I mean, obviously, I kind of talked about that and how it's helped me even get the next job, right? I went from going to one company to the other, being able to leverage my experience with PlanGrid. So having that sort of, just having that experience and being able to have touched that software was something that gave me a leg up on working with somebody. And I also had a very similar conversation to one of the foremen that I was managing at one point. And I was telling him, because he was saying that he wanted to go to school and get a degree in construction management. And I was like, honestly, if you learn how to use this app, and this app, you could just do my entire job. There was even this guy that we hired as an intern who had already finished his bachelor's degree in Egypt. But for whatever reason, we didn't value his degree in this country. And so he was working as an intern for us, working on his master's at this point. And one of my coworkers was extremely exhausted with him and was like, I can't work with this guy, I can't teach him. And so I asked our supervisor if I could take this guy under my wing. And it took me 3 days to show him how to use, I think we're using Prolog with that company at that point. So it took me 3 days to show him how to use Prolog and do what he needed to do to help me personally finish the goals that I needed to do, to show my boss that, hey, look, this is where we're at. We're in this part of turning over this building to the owner, and here's like where we're at. So it took me 3 days to walk through all this stuff with this guy. And he was so helpful. My personal production, because of his work, went up through the roof. And when I showed those numbers to my boss, he was like, okay, we're obviously not going to get rid of this guy. So software has shown me personally, through my experiences and the experiences of people that I've worked with, how it's allowed us to go through barriers that we couldn't tackle previously.
Yeah, and I think for most of us, we're believing that technology is disrupting construction across the board. It's not just disrupting construction as a industry, it's disrupting the way business as usual is done. And there's good and bad that comes with that. But we all see this future state where we believe, based on technology we use in our everyday life, can be applied to the business to drive it forward. I do want to keep track of time because I think we only have 3 minutes. Jeff did message me. Jeff, I wanted to give you a chance to ask Ezra your question.
Yeah, I wanted to get, because you talked about intersectionality, and I think that's like crucial, like versus inclusion. So my vernacular has changed. I like that because I've been looking for something else, because inclusion is like assimilation and feels horrible because that's not the idea, right? But
right.
Could you have examples of it so that we can understand it? Because I think intersectionality is like the pathway to equality of pay, equality of access, right? And I don't know that everybody understands what you're saying there.
Yeah. I don't know if I understand what I'm saying. I just know what I want.
We'll explain that
so,
then, because I think that's
okay, yeah,
the
for sure.
key.
No, I can try. So there's like this idea of, there's a difference between like accepting somebody and really caring for somebody, right? We can like tolerate things. We can tolerate and accept things, whatever. But then we can also care for people and care about people. And that's how I see the differences. It's like when you are tolerating something, you're tolerating something to a certain degree. There's going to be a level where you're like, all right, this is where I draw the line. But when you truly care for somebody and care about somebody, and you care about equality, you care about whatever, that's kind of like where you see the intersectionality of that being that person. They're not just this one thing. They're not locked to a diversity number for you. Like, it needs to become a personal thing. Does that make sense? Make more sense? Yeah. I mean, that's just how I see it. I mean, you can probably read a bunch of books about it. There's probably a lot of material already out there about intersectionality. But I think, yeah.
Eric just listed Ijoma Ulu's book. Do you remember the title of that book, Eric?
Yeah, it's so you want to talk about race, which I can send a link to here.
I have a comment. I've been thinking as I hear all these stories. So it seems that, Ezra, for you, what really defined your path to success was your work performance and not necessarily who we are. And if we become extremely factual, that should be the way it is, right? Like, if your success should be defined of how good you do and not, the color of your skin or your sexuality or anything like that. But I guess the other end of this dichotomy is that we are who we are, and that's what makes us individuals. So we shouldn't be disconnected completely. So I don't know what you guys think about this, because definitely work performance is extremely important, but somehow we cannot stop being who we are.
Well, I think what I was trying to explain through my story is that my performance was ultimately not the thing that helped me succeed. Because no matter what my performance looked like, I was never promoted because of my performance. I actually was promoted and didn't even get a salary change for one of my jobs. So my salary stayed the same and I got more responsibility. So they would recognize that I was working hard, but I wouldn't even be compensated for that change. I had to make the decision to leave companies and go work somewhere else where I was financially compensated for my efforts. And then ultimately I had to leave the industry because I saw that someone like me did not exist in a role that I wanted to be in, that I would see myself in.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so I'm still figuring out what that looks like. I'm always going back and forth if I really even want to stay in the construction world. I'm also an artist, so I'm kind of all over the place.
The construction world needs artists.
Yeah, it's true.
And I think, Carlos, you bring up a really good point, which thankfully there's data that's coming around this topic, around the idea of bringing your authentic self to a job, which means who you are, all parts and pieces and facets. And I think we all recognize that in order to get work done in a business environment, we adapt ourselves to be what that environment needs us to be effective. Rebecca and I are actually going to be on an internal panel with Procore next week talking about how to be an authentic female in a male-dominated environment. I'm so excited. This was a lot of Rebecca's brainchild based on her experience. But I think what we're finding and what the data is telling us is that when there's psychological safety and individuals can bring their authentic self to the workplace, creativity goes up, the ability to critically think through ideas, to have the safe space to disagree, have productive conflict, all those things start to come into play. And thankfully, there's groups like the Catalyst group, which starts to measure this in ways that we can see, how is this having an impact? So although we talk about inclusivity and thinking of it in terms of assimilation, I've had many conversations with Procore's Senior Director for Global Inclusion and Diversity. And I really like the way she says it is inclusivity means you can bring your full authentic self to the job, and you can agree to disagree. You can have productive conflict. You can have very differing views and ideas that oppose each other. But because of the psychological safety and the understanding that we are meant to be different, it creates the space for creativity that we probably haven't really experienced in the business environment today, because our traditional business environment is about assimilating to a culture that is defined by founders, et cetera, or business norms. So personally, I feel we have not seen the business results we can get if we actually create an environment where people can be their authentic self. And I think on that note, Dan, you're my moderator. Are we about to be pushed into the
I think we have about a minute and a half. I do have one question, one
Yes.
final question. So where is the line, where is the divide between identity and capitalism? So if no one's going to ask for a raise, why give them a raise? I become more profitable. My company becomes more profitable. You know, I've had this conversation with my girlfriend, resulting in her being empowered to go to her boss and say, hey, I bust my ass. I do more and I understand this better than you. I deserve this. And sure enough, she was awarded a raise, because I feel there's sometimes ideology gets skewed with corporate gains versus me, myself, I, in this kind of paradigm between the two. And at the end of the day, again, it goes back to my original comment about your self-empowerment. If they're not going to align with you principally, leave. I mean, that's not an organization you want to be a part of. So I always struggle with that. And I've had my issues at projects of, am I undervalued or overvalued or this or that? Does that person make more? Does that make less? You know, I would love to be a billionaire and live on an island in Tahiti, but you know, there's some things that we can and can't do. And I struggle with that of the capitalism versus the, you know, identification of individuals. So it's a fine line. And where do you draw that line, you know?
14 seconds ain't gonna cover it, but I think it's the right question to ask.
Everyone's homework. All right, we'll meet next month and we'll discuss that question.
Starts at the top.
Thank you.
A lot of people. How many of these folks were mid-sentence when that happened?
I try and provide warnings every time.
Yeah, this was not enough time to discuss this topic, but it was nonetheless a great conversation. We did a little bit of a different approach this time, and we actually chose to do a fireside chat. Ezra Teshome was our guest, who was kind enough to share his experience from going into college to getting internships to starting out in the construction industry, experiencing very clear examples of inequality and lack of access to promotion and career development based on the fact of the color of his skin and some of the biases that he came up against. And also looking at what led him then to technology and how his experience has been different now with a technology company. But the conversation was great because we were talking about intersectionality and how that's different from inclusion. And so if you're not familiar, intersectionality is the definition, the formal definition is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So Ezra was saying, being a little bit more of a skeptic based on some of his experience, he views inclusion and diversity as more of a corporate concept because his reality experience was showing that there's still a lot lacking, and assimilation is kind of this norm we're trying to get to, but the beauty really comes in our differences, how we look differently at a problem or at a challenge, how we see a path forward differently. So he was speaking to some of his experience there, as well as talking to, when we talk about inclusion, who's including who? So if we have a predominantly group of white individuals who are including Black, Latinx, women, LGBTQ, when there's a dominant group that's in leadership, those who are from the minority groups experience a very different reality, interactions, access to mentorship, navigating advancement. It's a different experience. Dan brought up a really good comment around being self-motivated, having the ability to be self-motivated to kind of self-advance, to advocate on behalf of yourself. And we talked about some of Ezra's experience with pay inequality. With things like Glassdoor, you can now look up and see what some of the benchmarks are around pay. And so whereas in past you may not have been able to advocate for yourself outside of saying, based on my performance, I deserve X, you actually can now say, based on benchmarking and my performance, I deserve X. And if you're not being paid around that area, the same area, you're seeing that there's inequality, and it's not just performance-based. And so we then kind of talked about how technology, as it's disrupting construction, is also disrupting a lot of these opaque parts of business where we've never had clarity, like around equal pay for people of color and for women. We talked about how the flip side of that is, based on his ability to dive in and learn Plan Grid and learn different technology systems, he was then, through that technology, able to get advancement through becoming kind of an expert in the tech. And so it was a really great conversation around this idea of what is intersectionality, and looking at, it's not just about creating a utopic inclusive environment, it's about having a place where there's psychological safety so people can show up as who they truly are, with different perspectives, different points of view, so that we can approach the problems that we're trying to solve in construction differently.